Hey everybody, it's your man Akil again. Seeing as how there was a pretty major event in world politics within the past few weeks, I figured I couldn't let the opportunity pass by to have a discussion with some really well-placed individuals on that subject. So first on the list is my good friend Josie Cardozo, who attended, believe it or not, Cardozo Law School with me just a few short years ago. I wanted to get her take on the death of Fidel Castro, given her own connection to that country and her hopes for its future. Thanks so much for joining me. Welcome. Why don't I just start out by inviting you to share some information with my viewers about your own background, your own family background, your own ties to Cuba, etc.
Sure. So my family came from Cuba in the 60s and the 80s. By my mother's side, she came in the 1960s with my grandparents from Spain. So she's been here a lot longer, but my dad came from Cuba to Miami in the Mariel boat lift, which is commonly known as a boat lift in English, where basically Castro just allowed Cuba's scum to get on boats and send them over to the United States as part of the punishment for the embargo. As part of that, he was just one of those folks that happened to be on the boat lift. People who were involved and were not involved in political crimes were also in that huge immigration. So they met in Miami, and after, I want to say almost 10 years from him being in the United States, I was born in Miami, and I grew up around Cuban culture, Cuban politics, Elian Gonzalez, the whole ordeal with him, which is also very relevant to our discussion today, and seeing how he has reemerged into TV. And it was just a great time to be in Miami for us, but moving away from Miami, coming to New York for law school actually helped me realize how we live in a bubble in Miami. And it's been great to experience something so great for my people from New York, not being in Miami and seeing how other people react to it. So I was thrilled that you asked me to speak about it, just because I've gotten a lot of mixed feelings here in New York. And it's been kind of weird to me coming from a culture where we're in Miami, everybody's been celebrating for 2 weeks. But here in New York, it's like people are mourning for someone that, we just don't have anything good to say about. So it's been surreal to be away from Miami and to be here. Yeah, it is huge in world politics, and it's huge for us, and it means a lot for the Cuban people and for the rest of us. So the fact that I'm even able to comment on it, I can't thank you enough. I really appreciate it.
Great. I didn't even realize that you had relatives who come over in the Mariel boat lift specifically.
Yeah.
Interesting. Just for those of you who don't know, if you aren't familiar with this event in Cuban and American history, take a look at the first scene from the movie Scarface. Not that that's an accurate portrayal of Cuban-Americans or the Cuban people.
What it is. It really is.
If you say so, I'll take your word for it. Yeah, Tony Montana's story. He was supposedly a Marielito. So that's so interesting. That really piques my curiosity, because from what I've read about the migration of exiles from Cuba to South Florida, I understand that there's a difference between Cubans who left the island in the late 50s and early 60s, in the early years after the revolution, and those who left in more recent decades, like in the boat lift. Supposedly, the Marielitos and a lot of more recent arrivals tended to be of a more diverse racial background, as well as from like the lower rungs of socioeconomic rungs of Cuban society. Did you ever observe, growing up in Miami, any divisions within the Cuban community there, whether political or otherwise?
Yeah, absolutely. With every wave of migration that has come from Cuba, obviously the people have been different. The people who fled in the 50s tend to be Cuban elitists who were seeing that the revolution was quickly shifting from what they had anticipated to something that they were not expecting. Fidel Castro came in essentially overthrowing in a military coup Batista, the dictator, the US-backed dictator at the time. And with that, he came with promises of basically wiping out elitism in Cuba. He kept saying he wasn't communist, so he just wanted to pretty much bring a stronger middle class and more access to the people, right? He said that sports were only available to the white and the rich. So he wanted to change that. And he promised making everything accessible to everyone. And at that time, with the racial divide that we had in Cuba, believe it or not, we had a very strong Black population, but at the same time, there was a strong white population. Even Batista, who was a mulatto, wasn't allowed to go into many clubs because of the racial segregation that we had in Cuba at the time. So with Fidel coming in and the promises that he made to the people that left at that time were realizing more like, oh, it's threatening my big business, right? So I need to get out of here. And then in the 60s came people who eventually saw Castro admit that he had become communist and realized that that's not what they wanted for their children. You saw, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Peter Pan kids. Pedro Pan. Willie Chirino is one of those kids. The Kiwanis were part of those kids. And it was essentially families that put their young boys on boats and send them to the United States by themselves so that they could escape the fact that Castro had said that every young child had to serve in work camps once reaching a certain age in Cuba. So middle school over there, they sent you out to the fields and things of that nature to do manual labor. And these families wanted to prevent their young boys from being sent to war and to camps. So they sent them out to the United States. Then the 70s came and there was migrations to different countries. You have Cubans that came in through Panama. You have Cubans that came in, like good friends of mine, through Costa Rica. So it really depends on what year you left and which country you came in through. And then came the Mariel boat lift, which pretty much changed everything. It's funny that you mentioned Scarface because I can't think of a more accurate portrayal of Miami in the 1980s from what I've heard. Cocaine Cowboys.
That's one of my favorite documentaries ever. Don't even get started on Cocaine Cowboys.
You get a pretty raw view of what Miami was like in the 80s. And obviously cocaine had a lot to do with it because you had a lot of Cubans coming in who were professionals, but they really didn't have any background here in the United States, doctors that couldn't practice, lawyers. So, you know, a lot of people turned to things that they shouldn't have. A lot of them turned to the illegal trade, but others did great things. And they established a system in Miami whereby they each used their own trade to trade with others. And that system essentially made the city of Miami, because if I had a furniture store, I exchanged my furniture for whatever you could pay me with at the time. And through that bartering system, they established a city and a way of living, and a city that today the Cubans who are coming are saying that the Cubans who came and that built that city had no idea what they were doing and that they don't understand the mechanisms of being in the United States, which is shocking to me because I'm sure you've seen Versailles and the conversations that go on there. And it's really shocking to me that somebody who just came can criticize the same people that established and paved the way for the Cuban Adjustment Act and the wet foot, dry foot policy and many things that have paved the way for a special immigrant status that many Cubans enjoy in this country. So yes, with each wave of migration, I can say that it's gotten worse because it's been a product of communism. The people who left in the 50s, 60s, and maybe even 70s were professionals. But when Castro's communism was alive and well, and people started realizing that they had to hustle to live, there wasn't much of an incentive to become a professional anymore. A doctor in Cuba makes $20 a month if you're lucky. So the incentive is not there to become a professional. The incentive is to hustle to live. And that's what you bring when you come to this country. And those that are coming now, the balseros from the 90s that come in the rafts and that have been coming ever since, they come with that mentality that you come here to hustle, that you come here, and we're partially to blame. We are partially to blame for that because we go back to Cuba and we portray a living that we might not have here. We show them pictures of things that might be our cars but might not be. We show them a standard of living that they have never even thought was possible. So they come here with that in mind, thinking, I'm going to get here and I'm going to have a Beamer within a week and I'm going to have a great job and a beautiful home. And they're hit with the harsh realities that the United States is not what many Cubans make it out to be. And I feel like that's what's heavily affected the migrations that we have right now, and the fact that newer Cubans or newer arrivals are not in line with the political views of the older ones. Older Cubans tend to be far more Republican conservative. Newer arrivals, Cubans that just came within the last 10 years, I think lean more towards the Democrat side because they don't understand the implications of Bay of Pigs and why many Cubans are Republicans to begin with. I can say that each wave of migration will change and you're always going to get a different Cuban and a different perspective depending on where you came and when you came.
Actually, my next question was going to be about what the political climate in Miami's Cuban community was like when you were growing up. From an outsider's perspective, especially growing up in Canada, where most of the opinion you hear is very sympathetic to Castro. You may have heard our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, gave a statement after Castro died that was sort of glowing with praise for Castro. And it's not surprising because his father was Prime Minister of Canada from the late 60s to the early 80s, and he was a personal friend of Fidel Castro. Castro was one of the elder Prime Minister Trudeau's pallbearers at his funeral back in the year 2000. 40 years ago, in 1976, Pierre Trudeau, who was then Prime Minister of Canada, visited Cuba and gave a speech extolling the virtues of the revolution.
So it's funny that you even bring that up, because I saw Justin Trudeau's response and I couldn't believe it. I've always admired him. I've always admired Canadian politics. So when he came out to his defense, I was really taken back by it. But that obviously makes a lot of sense to me now.
So most of the opinion you hear about Castro in my neck of the woods is all pro-Castro. I was on the ride home from the hospital just a week and a half ago, and the cab driver told us all about how his brother is working as a doctor in Cuba for the past couple of years, and he has only good things to say about Cuba's healthcare system. And over the years, I've learned to take a lot of that with a grain of salt. Dictatorships will tend to only expose foreign visitors to the cream of the crop so that they come away with a positive image of what life is like in those countries. Usually what people in my position hear is that in Miami, all of the propaganda is anti-Castro, especially if you live in the Cuban community. You won't ever hear anything good about Castro, and everyone's a Republican, and there's a crushing ideological conformity that's imposed on everyone. So I was wondering what your take on that is. I guess you've already started to answer that question, saying that more recent waves of Cubans are more likely to be Democrats?
Mm-hmm. As far as Miami's concerned, not everybody is anti-Castro, believe it or not. There are still Cubans that are communist. They're alive and well, which is shocking to me because I feel like anybody who's Cuban and is communist is literally living a lie. What I've also noticed is that all this sympathy that I've heard about Castro, nobody who sympathizes with him has ever lived under his dictatorship. And I think that that's amazing because it's very easy to say the great things that have come out of Cuba. Of course, when you start picking away at the negative, what does it mean to have 130,000 trained doctors when less than 10,000 of those are probably even left on the island? And what does it mean when those doctors become doctors? Because that's the only way to leave the island on a mission aside from being an athlete. When you come to really pick at the things that made communism great in Cuba, it starts to fall apart. The way that people talk about him without really knowing the effects that he had on the Cuban people, it's hurtful as a Cuban-American, and it's hurtful as a political science student, and it's hurtful as a woman because of the things that he did to my people. It shows me that there's a lot of ignorance, and people see what they want to believe. He did great things for the rest of the world, but who suffered because of that? He did those things on the sweat of his own people. He was the first to send aid to Venezuela and to many other countries, but his own people were starving. They have a ration system in Cuba where you have to basically live off of what the government provides on a weekly basis. You're not allowed to have red meat. How can you really praise anything like that? And coming from a democracy, like, to me, that's crazy because I can sit here and talk all the crap that I want about Obama and nobody's going to come through my door and arrest me.
Bingo.
But in Cuba right now, the people are forced to mourn and grieve for 9 days. The death of somebody that they didn't even elect and that they've had to mourn for 60 years, because that's what the Cuban people have been doing for 60 years, mourning and living day to day on whatever the government provides. You can't say happy birthday within these 9 days. You couldn't say congratulations. You couldn't show any sign of happiness, even if it was your birthday.
At the turn of the millennium, apparently Castro declared that there were to be no celebrations of the new millennium because the millennium wouldn't actually begin until 2001 rather than 2000. Apparently it was against the law to celebrate New Year's Eve or to celebrate the new millennium until January 1st, 2001, that kind of thing.
Until recently, they didn't celebrate Christmas and they didn't celebrate many holidays that we celebrate that tend to be very universal, that have nothing to do with the United States. Everything, if you ever go to Cuba, you'll see everything is blamed on the U.S. embargo. So the Cuban people have to suffer because this is how we're going to get back at the United States. We're not going to celebrate what they celebrate, and we're not going to do what they want us to do. We're going to do what we want to do, and if you have a problem with it, blame the United States for it. You don't have red meat, blame the United States. Everywhere you go, it's like propaganda. The U.S. did this, and this is a U.S. embargo, and you have like hands punching towards Cuba. Everything is to lead you into the perception that Americans are to blame for everything that's going on. And while many things could have gone differently had the United States acted differently back in 59 in the 60s, you can't say that everything that's been going on in Cuba for the past 60 years, that the U.S. is completely to blame. I have my own personal views on what might have happened had the Soviet Union not been the one to give their landing hand. But at the same time, I also know that he was a communist from the very beginning, and that we realized that he was a communist from the very beginning. And had that been my choice back then, I probably wouldn't have sided with that either. Many didn't realize it from the get-go, and many to this day don't want to accept what became of his promises and his lies to the Cuban people. But when I went in December 2014, I actually stayed in the house of a communist couple. The minute I walked in, there were pictures of them hugging with Fidel Castro because they were generals in his army when he went through Sierra Maestra and he took over in Havana. And I sat down with them and I was like, I just want to be completely honest. I do not believe in any of this system, but I want you to tell me from an insider's perspective, because nobody considers me Cuban, right? I was born here, so what do I know? But I was like, I want you to tell me from your perspective, did this really work? Was this what you wanted? And they looked at me with tears in their eyes and they told me, we were lied to. This is not what we wanted. This is not what we thought would happen. And we have been trying to fix this forever. We've tried to figure out ways to leave, but because they used to be generals, they're not even given visas to leave the country.
Wow.
I think that's a harsh reality. And I think it's very easy to praise a man when you don't know things like that. When you don't know that he doesn't allow you to walk freely, to mention his name in the negative light in public. And when you don't know about the ladies in white who are getting beaten on a daily basis because they're peacefully protesting the death of their sons and their brothers and their husbands who are political prisoners. It's a very harsh reality. And to get back to what the original question was about Miami, to hear someone say, yes, he was a great man and he was the best thing that ever happened. And, now you see videos all over the internet about Cubans praising him and that everybody in Havana is so sad. That's lies, because there's no freedom of press in Cuba and there's definitely no freedom of speech. So for anybody to sit in front of a camera and say that and you not realize that that is not something that comes out of someone naturally, that it's forced and that they want you to believe it, knowing that they don't believe it themselves, that's what true pain looks like. That's what censorship looks like. Because we don't have that in this country, we can't realize it. We can't spot it. Because here, if I don't like something, I can stand in front of the White House and protest. But there, not even in their own homes, because you never know who's an undercover police. So you don't know who's gonna come into your house.
Yeah, I had an argument with some relatives of mine about 10 years ago, and we were talking about whether democracy is the best system of government known to man or not. And I was saying, yes, it's not perfect, but it's the least bad system. And they were disagreeing. One of the things I pointed out was none of you in this room would last 2 seconds in an actual alternative to democracy of the kind that you're praising. Castro's regime came up, and I said, how many of you could actually live for 5 seconds in a country where you have to watch what you say, even in the privacy of your own home, because if the wrong person overhears you and maybe misinterprets what you're saying as anti-government sentiment, they can report you to the secret police. Like Tony Montana says at the beginning of Scarface, there's a chivato on every corner telling you how to think and how to feel. Hell, if your neighbor has a dispute with you and doesn't like you for some reason, he can claim falsely that you said something against the regime and get you thrown in jail just based on that suspicion. We in countries like Canada or the United States, we can imagine what it's like to live under that kind of system. So I totally agree with you when you point out that it makes no sense for us in our privileged position to praise a regime like Castro's, nor does it make sense to just buy into a lot of his propaganda. You probably remember a few years ago when we were in law school, a guy who was a year ahead of me and 2 years ahead of you published an article in the student newspaper in which he praised Castro's regime and denounced the Miami propaganda machine and so on. And he said, I went to Cuba on a visit and I saw that the Cuban people were proud of this revolution that they've built. And back in 2002, there was a referendum in which 90-something% of the population voted to keep the regime in place. And I said, I bet you when I look up the information about this referendum, there's gonna be something fishy. Guess what? 5 minutes of Googling, and the first thing I found out was that in that referendum in 2002, there were only 2 options on the ballot. The question was, do you support the revolution, essentially? The only options were yes and abstain. There was no option. I wonder what kind of message that sent to the average Cuban voter, right? So I totally agree with what you're saying, and I'm so glad to hear it. I guess that brings me to my next question, which is really about the embargo. What are your personal views on it? As well as what kind of attitudes do you tend to hear about the embargo among Cuban-Americans your age?
The minute that I heard about the embargo, I was getting ready to leave to Cuba. So I was already having my own feelings about it, right? As a Cuban-American, as somebody who was going to be over there while they were announcing it, what was I supposed to feel? You know, like, am I allowed to have any sorts of feelings as somebody who wasn't born there? And I was thrilled. I was immediately thrilled because I never thought I was going to live to see the day that they would wave an American flag in Havana. And I knew what that meant, right?
Oh, so you're referring to like Obama's recent overtures, diplomatic overtures to Cuba?
Yeah. When all of this was happening, I was like, oh my God, this could be great, right? This is going to be probably the best thing to happen to us. And then the following month started to settle in, more discussions. And I started to realize our current relationships with Cuba, how did we get here? I never thought that the embargo benefited anybody other than the Castros. It hurt the Cuban people tremendously because it cut off access to the United States completely. And the only way that they could have that access was by defecting and by reaching the United States by any means, whether it be by a raft through the border, which many Cubans, believe it or not, do cross through other countries and then through the border. Not everybody comes on boats. So from the beginning, I always knew that the embargo was not something that was going to benefit the Cuban people. But I also knew that as an American, I thought that it was necessary because we needed to have a tough stand on communism. And I knew that we needed to let the Castros know that we weren't going to have conversations with them without them knowing that there are things that needed to change on the island. And because they weren't willing to come to the table and they weren't willing to offer freedom of speech, freedom of press, basic human rights, civil rights, we were not going to have any sort of relationship with them. And that's why I thought the embargo was necessary. From a personal perspective, from being there, from seeing the people, I knew that it was hurting them. So when Obama announced that he was having communications with Raul Castro and that they were willing to sit down and make certain concessions, I was ecstatic. And then I saw that there weren't many concessions on behalf of the Castro regime, right? So yeah, they sat down, they talked with Obama, they talked with the Pope, everything's great. But when Obama's there, all the ladies in white, las damas de blanco, which are the women that peacefully protest, they had been arrested and they had been detained in their homes so that Obama couldn't see that they were protesters. Anybody else who was even suspected of possibly protesting was also detained in their homes. And those that weren't detained were eventually beat in the middle of the street and harassed and threatened. So thinking about it from a completely different perspective, aside from a Cuban-American, I'm torn about what the embargo means and about what lifting the embargo means because, one, I have yet to see Raul Castro say that he's going to offer anything, right? So I keep hearing that Google is going to be offering internet in Cuba. Let's see how that works. Let's see what that access to internet really means, right? Because they have service providers. But what does it mean when I go on Google? Am I going to be able to search freely? Am I going to be able to get all sorts of news? Or are you going to continue to censor the types of information that I'm allowed to access? Because even when Cubans are allowed to watch our State of the Union address here in the United States, it's censored and there's parts that are missing. And people wouldn't realize that unless you were to watch them in Spanish and in English and notice that there's serious parts missing and things that were not mentioned because the Cuban government doesn't want the Cuban people to know that the United States is in fact not at fault for many of the crises that happen in Cuba, for the socio-political issues that are going on, for their lack of food, for the economic status of many folks in the country. It's things that you hear about and you're like, okay, things are going to change, but are they really? Are we just negotiating with the Castros to give an appearance that things are going to change? Or are we really going to start telling them, listen, sit down, and this is what we want. We want the Cuban people to have basic human rights. We want there to be an election. We want there to be referendums where people are actually given the option to voice their opinions. I've always joked about it, but at least in Venezuela, they have the appearance of an election, right? It's rigged, but at least, you have the people thinking that they're going out and they're voting. We never had that in Cuba. We never had the option to at least pretend that he was elected, right? To tell the people, well, you came out, you voted, right? There's a chance that we elected him. We never had that. And not to take away from the Venezuelan people, I feel it's awful what's going on, but it just goes to show you that we don't even have that. We have, this is what you're going to get, this is what you're not going to get, and either you like it or you abstain. Either you agree, either you're with us or you're against us. when I have clients here telling me that they're not communist, I was like, we don't know what you are, right? Because when you're over there, you have to agree or you die. I mean, you don't have that option. You don't have the freedom to voice your opinion. So my opinion on the embargo always was, it's hurting my people, but from a political standpoint, we need to stand strong. And hoping year after year that the Castros were going to be like, you know what? I think it's time. We should really, come back to the negotiating table. When Castro came in, was it appropriate for the United States to create the embargo at that time? Absolutely. But we also have to keep in mind that things have to change with time. Now that Fidel's no longer around, maybe Raul doesn't have that voice in the back of his head that's telling him, remember the revolution, remember what we stand for. Maybe he'll be that one person from the Cuban Revolution that will realize that times have changed and that the embargo isn't benefiting anyone. We can both benefit, both Cubans here and Cubans on the island. Everyone can benefit from having a relationship with Cuba, from dismantling that oppressive regime and creating a system where people are able to have a say in some way, or feel at least like they have one, right? So I don't think that immediately just saying, you know what, this is going to be a democracy now. We don't have communism anymore. We're going to have work weeks and paid vacations. I don't think the Cuban people would respond to that because they don't realize what that means. They don't know what working 40-hour weeks mean and things like that, because everything in Cuba is very different. A lot has to change between now and then. But I would have liked to see Obama sit down and say, we need to discuss this a little bit more. We need a few more things from you. I'm married to the fact that he needed to soften them up a bit to be able to get to the point where we are right now. But I also wish, as the United States, we would have asked for more than just exchanging prisoners. I wish we would have asked for something else for the Cuban people. I wish we would have demanded at least a shred of change, because I haven't seen any change in the past 2 years. I haven't talked to anybody that's told me things have changed. I was there in a crucial time when all of this was going on, and to be completely honest, there was no toilet paper. I mean, how basic can you possibly get when there's no toilet paper, even with US dollars? It's things that it pains me to share them with other people, because I think people think that we're lying, because nobody can really imagine what it's like. And to see a Castro or a Che Guevara shirt in New York City hurts me to my core. Everybody talks about it from this lens, like, oh my God, free healthcare, free education? Are you kidding me? You know how much my insurance is? Yeah, I do know how much your insurance is. I also know that I have $300,000 in student loans because I chose to be a lawyer, while a lawyer in Havana didn't have to pay for it. But I'm able to practice freely. I'm able to say what I want, and I'm able to do a lot of things that that lawyer in Havana could not do. And I can also guarantee you that that free education, it costs a lot more than money. It costs people to give up hope. It caused people to give up dreams. Many of the people who have professions in Cuba, they're not even the professions that they wanted, because everybody knows that anything outside of the capital, good luck if there's any room in those programs by the time that they make it out to your towns. I know people who settled for mediocre careers in their minds. I've seen the best of communism in a sense. I've seen professionals, amazing doctors, amazing, well-rounded individuals who could speak 5 languages and still tell you that they would have given all of that up to have the choice, the ability to choose what they wanted to do with their lives, to choose where they were going to live, how they were going to live. Because if you look, like you say, 5 minutes of Google, the substandard conditions in Cuba, buildings that are falling apart, they've had to evacuate people because the house that they were living in was literally going to fall any minute. That is what people should be thinking of when they think of him. And that's what they should be talking about. Okay, what good came out of this, right? I mean, what good came out of it, and what did it cost? And nobody can really tell me what it cost, because they haven't lived through it. They haven't suffered it. I essentially can't say that I suffered it either, because I haven't, but I've witnessed it. And hearing my mother's stories, my father's stories, hearing my grandparents cry at the news, that allows me to have a say, and that allows me to comment. Because while others might be like, well, you were born here, what do you know? I know more than you can imagine, because hearing those stories, That's where the feeling comes from. And that's why people are out in the streets of Miami celebrating with pots and pans, because there's grandparents and great-grandparents who didn't outlive this man, but wanted to from the bottom of their core. They wanted to outlive him, and they wanted to say, like, you know what? There's hope that's over. I feel like that's what the death means, right? The fact that now we're hoping that we've turned a new page on Cuban politics, that we've turned a new page on world politics, and that there's uncertainty. Let's say Raul were to die, his daughters, and there's no Castros left. What's next for us? Who's going to step up to the plate? Who's going to change everything we've ever known? And who's going to bring the Cuban people what we think they need? The U.S.? And I think that scares me.
It's so interesting you bring that up, because I remember a few years ago when it looked like Castro might have been likely to die.
Yeah.
I was reading an article at National Review Online, which is obviously very conservative and Republican. And one of the articles, I think they had a symposium, and one of the articles said, if Castro dies and the regime crumbles, the U.S. should move in. And one of the policies it should implement would be to turn Cuba into a free trade area where, you know, there'll be a free movement of goods and people and capital with other countries. And I remember thinking to myself, no, that's going about it all wrong, because free trade might be a good policy on the whole, and I personally support it, and I would hope that the Cuban people themselves would support it over the long run. But for the United States to impose that on Cuba, possibly against the will of the people there, and perhaps too quickly when the country is still adjusting to no longer having a communist regime in place, that would just be a disaster of epic proportions, and it would be wrong. The Cuban people should be able to determine their own destiny, and it's partly because so many Cubans, as well as their sympathizers around the world, felt that the country was not able to determine its own destiny because of U.S. interference before the revolution. That's one of the many reasons why so many people in Cuba supported the revolution and continued to support Castro for so long. So even just strategically thinking, it would be a mistake for the U.S. to shove free market policies down the throats of the Cuban people. I thought that would just be counterproductive and, again, wrong in principle. Anyway, we're running out of time, which is a shame, because I could listen to you share your thoughts on this all night, believe you me.
And I could talk about it all night, believe it or not.
Absolutely. So just to wrap up, when it comes to the embargo, for example, I think the embargo was understandable immediately after the revolution, like you said earlier. But to my way of thinking, once a policy's been in place for several decades without any visible change, just as a practical matter, the smart thing to do is to at least consider reforming or repealing it, just because it hasn't worked, even if it's justified in principle. So my personal view is that the embargo should be phased out, and even if the regime doesn't make concrete concessions in exchange for that reform, hopefully in the long run, the greater interaction at a grassroots level between ordinary Cubans and ordinary Americans will help bring about the kind of change in Cuba that we saw in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union a generation ago. That's my personal belief, and that's my personal hope. I guess my last question would be, what do you think are likely to be the changes that we see now that Castro's gone and Donald Trump is about to become president?
I'm actually scared about what those changes might be, to be honest, because I think that Raul is more willing to negotiate with the United States, especially now that his big brother's not there watching over him. But I don't think Donald Trump would be willing to do the same. He's already said that he's willing to back out of any negotiations if Castro's weren't willing to concede to more things that were obviously on my agenda earlier. I'm hoping that that doesn't happen. I'm hoping that he doesn't completely back out. I'm hoping that they sit down and they're actually willing to come to some sort of agreement where we're not in a position as the United States to give up more power than we already have, but at the same time, be willing to negotiate with them to see what we can do as a country and as a government to help them move forward. I don't think that we've seen the end of communism in Cuba, just because, like you said, transitions are tricky. And I feel like the country is still in a position where it needs to adjust, because people respect Raul, but not as much as they feared Fidel. So I feel like we're in a very shaky position right now that we need to see how the people will react within the next 18 months or so and see what our position is going to be when Trump actually becomes president. As much as I'm dreading that right now, I actually fear for what might happen once he actually steps into power and the things that he might do and what he might impose. I fear that he will back out and that everything that has been done within the last 2 years would have been for nothing, and that he's going to start from scratch, and that we might go back to having a full embargo, and that we'll be back in a position where my family and I can no longer visit, and that we need to come up with pretexts just saying that we're part of cultural exchanges just to go and see friends and family. That is what I fear the most, not having access, and for the Cuban people not to have access to us here and to not have the ability to see us and to communicate with us. I'm hoping that that changes, whether it be little by little or in one drastic change that everybody needs to learn to quickly adjust to. I guess we'll see, and hopefully we can revisit this topic after January 20th when we know for sure what's going to happen and, you know, what Cuba has to say on it and what Donald Trump has to say, because apparently now he's talking on behalf of all of us. So I'm hoping that he has something good to say too, and that his views reflect ours in some way. I'm really hoping that that happens and that we are able to have this conversation again and that we're able to celebrate and visit and have a different interaction than the one that we're having right now. So we'll see what happens.
See, we shall. And I'm looking forward to definitely continuing this conversation after both Trump and Raul have been in power for a few more months and we can get a better feel for what the transition is likely to be like. I definitely share your hopes for Cuba's future because I've read a lot about Cuba and its history and its people, and it's a country I've always wanted to visit. It's definitely on my bucket list. But I would definitely like to be able to visit knowing that the money I spend there isn't going to go into the coffers of a communist regime, because I've always believed in freedom since I was a little boy. And while I'm opposed to the embargo on a few different grounds, at the same time, I totally understand the desire to avoid putting any kind of money in the Castro regime's pockets. I hope Cuba gets the kind of government that it really deserves, because it really hasn't had that since even before 1959. I'll be looking, I'll be paying attention, and thanks so much. Thanks so much for having this conversation with me. This has been really, really eye-opening. I've learned things from having this chat.
Thank you so much. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being the one to respond to that article in the Cardozo Jurist. And thank you for caring. Being from Canada and caring about world politics, I think we need more people like you that are willing to be open-minded and share in our pain and share in our glory. I really appreciate it. It means a lot to us.
You got it. So we'll all stay tuned, and I'm sure folks will be hearing from Josie again.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much, and have yourself a nice night.
Take care. Bye.